A group of kids kept trampling my garden, ruining my flowers. I spoke to their parents, but they just shrugged and said they're just kids. Hey there, welcome to today's story. Are you new to the channel, or have you just returned? Either way, I'm really glad you're here. And by the way, I'd really appreciate it if you could help me reach 1,000 subscribers soon. It'll motivate me to keep bringing more amazing stories like this one for you. Now, let's dive into today's story. Imagine this. You've spent years building something you truly care about only for someone to come in and destroy it without a second thought. How would you feel? Would you stand by and watch? Or would you take action? Today, we're following a character who's dealing with a similar situation. Can you relate? Have you ever faced something like this in your own life? Stick around till the end to find out how they handled it and what they learned along the way. I've lived in the same quiet suburban neighborhood for years. The kind of place where everyone knows your name, you wave to the old folks walking their dogs. And the kids run around the cul-de-sac like it's their own personal racetrack. The grass is always freshly mowed, and the houses are kept pristine. It's peaceful, or at least it was. Then came the hunters. The hunters were not the kind of family that fit in. Oh, they were loud, sure, and their kids, 3 of them, Jake, Nate, and Lily, ran around like they just escaped from a zoo. It didn't take long for their presence to disrupt the tranquility of our once peaceful street. You'd think someone would have warned me before they arrived. But no. One morning, while I was sipping my coffee, I saw them move in across the street. A family of 5. All with different colored hair and a kind of "we're too cool for this" attitude. I had no idea then that they would quickly become the highlight of my life. And not in a good way. The first thing I noticed was the kids. They didn't walk through yards like most kids do. They ran. They didn't just cut across the grass. They made a racetrack of everyone's lawns. They ran across my garden, trampling flowers like it was nothing, laughing as if it were some kind of game. I watched in shock as the youngest, a little boy named Jake, took a running leap right through my carefully tended tulips. I shook my head and thought, okay, maybe it's just a one-time thing. Kids do stupid stuff, right? But the thing is, it wasn't a one-time thing. Oh no, this was just the beginning. The next morning, I woke up early, still fuming but trying to calm myself down. I grabbed a cup of coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and watched the sunrise, trying to find some peace. But peace seemed like a distant memory now. My thoughts kept drifting back to my garden, the flowers I had spent so much time nurturing, now trampled into the dirt like they never mattered. It wasn't even about the flowers, though. Not really. It was about respect. About boundaries. I had a right to my space, to my work. And no one had the right to destroy that just because they didn't care. I didn't want to let it go. Not anymore. I couldn't. I put the cup down and stood up, wiping my hands on my jeans. I knew what I had to do. I had to talk to them. This couldn't go on. I couldn't just keep watching as my garden was turned into a racetrack for their kids. I walked across the street, my steps slow and deliberate. I tried to steady my breath, not wanting to walk in there with a head full of anger. But I couldn't help it. The rage was still bubbling under the surface. How could anyone, especially a parent, let their kids behave like this? It wasn't just a mistake anymore. It was intentional. Every time they ran through my garden, it was like a slap to the face. I rang the doorbell and waited. A minute passed, maybe 2. The door finally opened, but it wasn't the husband, Steve. It was her, the mother. The one I'd hoped would have some sense of responsibility. She stood there, looking like she had just rolled out of bed, her wild hair falling over her eyes. She looked disoriented, like I was interrupting her in the middle of some profound thought. And maybe I was. Maybe she had been daydreaming about her plans for lunch or what to watch on TV. It was hard to tell, given how little she seemed to care about anything else. "Yeah?" she asked, her voice flat, unimpressed, as if I was the one doing something wrong by standing on her doorstep. I could feel my jaw tighten. "Hi, I'm Greg. I live across the street. I was just wondering if you could tell your kids to stop running through my garden. They keep crushing my flowers." I tried to keep my tone friendly, measured, but I could feel the frustration rising with every word. I didn't want to start a fight, but at this point, I wasn't sure I could avoid it. She raised an eyebrow and shrugged, her expression more bored than concerned. "Oh, come on. They're just kids. They don't mean any harm." I blinked, stunned for a moment. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Just kids? The words hit me like a slap to the face. She dismissed the destruction of my hard work as if it were no more than a passing nuisance. As if my garden, my time, my effort didn't matter. But they broke my flowers. I said, unable to hold back the anger anymore. It's not just running through my garden. They're destroying everything. Her hand waved dismissively in the air as if she was brushing me off like an annoying fly. They'll grow back. Don't sweat it. Don't sweat it? I stared at her in disbelief, feeling my blood pressure rise. This was more than just a few crushed flowers. This was my sanctuary. This was the one place I had where I could escape, where I could unwind after long days at work, where I could see something I built with my own 2 hands flourish. And she was telling me it didn't matter? That it was just some flowers? I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell her everything. To tell her how much it hurt to see something I cared about being trampled over by her kids, and how, every time I tried to speak up, it felt like I was invisible. How, every time I raised a concern, I was met with indifference, as if my feelings were insignificant compared to the whims of her children. But I didn't. Instead, I took a deep breath, my chest tightening. I could feel the frustration building up in me like a pressure cooker, and for a moment, I was afraid I was going to explode. I had tried to approach this civilly, tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. But all she had done was laugh off my concerns, dismiss them as if they were nothing, as if I was just overreacting. And that's when I realized she wasn't going to get it. She wasn't going to change. No amount of talking, no matter how polite, would make her see my side. In her eyes, I was just the grumpy neighbor who cared too much about a few flowers. I forced myself to calm down, though the words burned in my throat. I'm serious, I said, my voice much quieter now, though I could feel the edge still lurking beneath. I really need you to do something about it. Your kids can't keep running through my garden. Her eyes didn't even flicker with recognition of the seriousness of the situation. She simply shrugged again, her gaze shifting toward the sky as if bored by this entire conversation. I'll talk to them, she said with a flippant tone, clearly not meaning it. I wanted to argue more, to say this isn't just about talking to them, but I knew it would be a waste of my breath. She wasn't listening. She wasn't hearing me. And in that moment, I felt a deep sense of helplessness. I had tried to be patient. I had tried to be kind. But what good was kindness when it was met with such blatant disregard? What good was patience when the person you were speaking to didn't even care? I took one last, long look at her before turning on my heel and walking back to my house, my heart pounding in my chest. Every step I took, I could feel the anger and disappointment growing inside me, simmering just beneath the surface. I wanted to do something, but I didn't know what. I wanted to make her understand how much this meant to me, but I knew that no matter how much I explained, it wouldn't make a difference. She wasn't going to get it, and I had just realized that the only person who cared about this garden was me. The days dragged on, and with them, the relentless destruction of my garden continued. What had started as a few stray steps through my flowers had become a full-on assault. It wasn't just the flowers anymore. They had graduated to jumping over my fence like it was some kind of game, sprawling over the top of it, laughing like they were on some sort of obstacle course. And each time they landed in the middle of my garden, the chaos would follow, flower beds crushed, plants uprooted, my carefully placed rocks turned into mere obstacles to be toppled over. It was as if my hard work meant nothing. I watched it all, helpless. It started to feel like the universe was mocking me. What had been a small annoyance was now a full-scale offense. I couldn't even enjoy the sight of my garden anymore without imagining the chaos they'd bring the next time they ran through it. And each time, they were louder, more reckless. Their joy fueled by the destruction they caused. I was losing control, and the worst part was, no one else seemed to care. The breaking point came when I caught Jake, one of the 3 kids, the oldest, hurling a rock straight at one of my garden gnomes. The gnome wasn't just a decoration, it was a gift from my late father. It stood there with a goofy grin on its face, a relic from a time when I still had my family around. I had always found it comforting. But now, as I watched Jake line up his throw, it was like watching someone throw a punch at the one thing I still had left that tied me to happier memories. The rock hit the gnome square in the chest, shattering it into pieces. I stood there, frozen for a moment, heart sinking into my stomach. The sound of the gnome cracking echoed in my head. It wasn't just a rock hitting a piece of ceramic, it was years of care and memories shattered right before my eyes. I felt my blood begin to boil. This was the moment I snapped. I didn't even think. I just acted. My body moved on its own. Without a second thought, I marched over to their house, fists clenched so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The fury inside me was like a fire raging out of control. I was done being passive, done trying to reason with people who couldn't or wouldn't understand what was at stake. I knocked on their door harder this time, my fist pounding against the wood with a force that matched the anger coursing through me. Steve opened the door. He looked like he had just come from some weekend tailgate party, beer belly hanging over his shorts, a careless grin plastered on his face. The man looked like he hadn't had a thought in his head in years. I could already tell that this conversation was going to go nowhere. "Your kids are ruining my garden," I yelled, my voice loud and shaking with anger. "You need to do something about it. Now." Steve's smirk didn't fade. He barely looked at me as if I were an inconvenience he could easily ignore. "Boys will be boys, man. It's just a garden." "Just a garden?" My chest tightened at his words. It felt like a slap in the face. Did he even know what he was saying? Did he understand how much I had invested in that garden, not just in time and money, but in the peace of mind it had given me? It wasn't just a garden. It was a part of me. It was the one thing I still had control over, the one place I could escape to after a long day. And he was standing there telling me it was just a garden? I clenched my jaw so hard I thought my teeth might crack. My vision blurred as a rush of heat filled my face, but I couldn't let him see how much his words were affecting me. "It's not just a garden," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "They're destroying my property. They've destroyed more than flowers. They've destroyed something I care about." Steve just shrugged, his lack of concern evident in the way he tilted his head back slightly as though he were humoring me. "Don't put breakable stuff outside then." I couldn't believe it. I was standing there, asking for basic respect, and this man was telling me it was my fault for caring too much about something as trivial as a garden gnome. It was like trying to talk to a brick wall. Only the wall didn't even have the decency to pretend it cared. I stood there, feeling the disbelief wash over me in waves. These people weren't just careless, they were reckless. They didn't care. They didn't respect anything. They weren't going to discipline their kids, and the worst part was they didn't think they needed to. They were making it clear that my problems were my own, and I was supposed to just deal with it. I felt a sharp pang of bitterness. How could someone be so dismissive, so utterly detached from the feelings of others? They were not just ignoring me, they were invalidating my experience. I wanted to scream, to let out all the frustration, the rage, the hopelessness I had been holding inside for so long. But I didn't. I forced myself to take a breath, though every fiber of my being was screaming at me to do something, to make them feel what I felt. But I couldn't. I stood there, swallowing my anger, trying to remind myself that screaming at them wouldn't help. They didn't care. They wouldn't listen. "So, what am I supposed to do, huh?" I asked, my voice shaking, not with fear, but with a seething frustration I could no longer contain. "Am I supposed to just stand here while they destroy everything I've worked for? While you let them run wild, ruining everything?" Steve didn't flinch. He didn't even look like he was listening. Instead, he ran his hand through his hair, a motion that struck me as self-satisfied. "You're overreacting, man," he said. "It's just a garden. Get over it." I wanted to punch him. I wanted to throw him across the yard and make him understand just how much this meant to me. But I couldn't. I stood there, boiling inside, and realized something that made my heart drop. He wasn't going to change. He wasn't going to care. They weren't going to stop. And for the first time, I felt completely, utterly helpless. The realization was like acid burning in my gut. I had spent so much time trying to be the reasonable one, trying to be the good neighbor, the one who took the high road. But what did it matter if no one else was willing to meet you halfway? What did it matter if you were the only one caring, the only one putting in effort? I turned and walked away without saying another word. I had nothing left to say. I knew that it wouldn't make a difference. Nothing I said, nothing I did would change anything. I was done. As I walked back to my house, my mind raced. What now? How much longer could I put up with this? How much longer would I just stand by, letting them destroy the one thing that had given me peace? I didn't know the answers, but I knew one thing. I couldn't take it anymore. I wasn't going to let this slide. Couldn't. Not after everything. Not after the countless times I'd stood by, watching them destroy what I had built with my own hands. Every time those kids jumped over my fence, every time their laughter rang through the air as they trampled my flowers. It was like they were mocking me, mocking everything I cared about. My garden wasn't just a hobby, it was my sanctuary, my escape from the stress of work and life. And they were treating it like it was nothing more than a plaything. The first few days after my confrontation with Steve were the hardest. I couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness. I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said, "It's just a garden." The more I replayed those words in my head, the more they gnawed at me. Just a garden. Was that all it was to them? To him? To anyone else who didn't understand? The anger bubbled inside me and I realized something. I wasn't just angry at Steve or his kids. I was angry at myself too. How had I let it go on for so long? I should have done something sooner. But now it was too late for regret. I wasn't going to be passive anymore. So I began plotting. I spent the next few days brainstorming, considering my options. What could I do to stop this madness? Something more than just a stern word or a slap on the wrist. I needed a solution that would send a message. Clear one. Something that would show Steve and his kids that I wasn't to be taken lightly. I called Rick, my buddy who ran a farm just outside the city. He was always good for advice when I needed something creative. And if there was one thing I had learned in my life, it was that when you're up against something as stubborn and disrespectful as this, you need to be a little inventive. "Dude, I've got just the thing for you," Rick said, his voice laced with laughter when I explained the situation. He probably thought I was joking at first. But when I told him how serious it had gotten, he gave me an idea I would never have come up with on my own. "I'll hook you up with a dog training mat. It's perfect." A dog training mat. I wasn't sure what he meant at first, but Rick explained it to me. Basically, it was a simple mat that delivered a small shock when anything stepped on it. Nothing dangerous. Just a little zap to teach the trespasser a lesson. It sounded perfect. It wasn't harmful, but it was definitely going to be uncomfortable. If the kids thought they could use my garden as their personal playground, I was going to make sure they thought twice before doing it again. But I didn't stop there. I started researching other ways to protect my space, ways that would teach them a lesson they'd never forget. I came across motion-activated sprinklers. They were designed to keep deer and other animals out of gardens by spraying water when anything moved within range. They seemed like the perfect addition to my plan. It would be hard for anyone to ignore a sudden blast of cold water in the middle of their fun. Still, I felt like something was missing. Something to make sure they understood just how serious I was. I didn't just want to inconvenience them, I wanted to shock them into realizing that they couldn't get away with this anymore. That's when I found it. A speaker. Not just any speaker, but one that could play a growl so deep, so terrifying, it would send shivers down anyone's spine. It sounded like something straight out of a horror movie. I was already grinning at the thought of it. The kids would be so freaked out they'd probably think they were in a haunted house. Now everything was coming together. It was time for payback. But as I stood there, imagining the looks on their faces when they stepped onto the mat, felt the cold water spraying them, and heard that blood-curdling growl, I couldn't help but feel a rush of exhilaration mixed with something else. Something darker. I wasn't proud of it, but I couldn't deny it. I was looking forward to it. After weeks of feeling helpless and dismissed, this was my chance to reclaim control. It wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about sending a message. They had crossed a line. And now it was time for them to understand the consequences. I spent the next day setting everything up. The dog training mat went right where they usually jumped the fence. I made sure the sprinklers were hidden just behind the bushes, and I connected the speaker to my phone, ready to play that growl at just the right moment. It was a methodical process, one that took time and patience. But as I worked, I felt a sense of satisfaction building inside me. I wasn't just sitting around anymore, hoping they'd stop. I was taking action. I was making sure they'd never step foot in my garden again. But there was still a part of me, deep down, that felt a little unsettled. What if I had gone too far? What if the kids got hurt? The mat wasn't dangerous, but what if they panicked and fell? What if they were traumatized by the growl? I tried to push those thoughts out of my mind, but they lingered, gnawing at the edges of my consciousness. Then again, I told myself they hadn't thought twice about destroying something I cared about. Why should I feel guilty about making them uncomfortable for a few minutes? They deserved to experience what it felt like to have their space disrespected. They needed to understand that there were consequences for their actions. By the time I was done setting everything up, the sun was starting to set, casting a golden light over the yard. I stepped back and admired my work. Everything was in place, ready for the night. I waited. The anticipation gnawed at me. My heart was pounding. What if they didn't come tonight? What if I had gone through all this trouble for nothing? But deep down, I knew they would. They couldn't resist. The kids had been so reckless, so carefree in their destruction. It was inevitable that they would come back. Sure enough, just as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to twinkle in the sky, I heard it, the familiar sound of sneakers slapping against the pavement, the low giggles that followed. They were coming. I turned off the porch light, watching through the blinds. My pulse quickened. This was it. The first boy, Jake, dashed toward the fence just as I had expected. He didn't see the mat. His foot landed squarely on it, and immediately he jerked back with a loud yell. Zap! I almost laughed, but I held myself in check. This wasn't just funny, this was necessary. They needed to feel the consequences of their actions. The other two boys hesitated. But they couldn't resist. They tried to move forward, and just as I'd hoped, the sprinklers kicked on, dousing them with cold water. The final touch was the growl. I pressed play on my phone, and the sound of a deep, guttural growl filled the air. It was like something out of a nightmare. The boys screamed, their voices high-pitched and full of fear. They turned and bolted. Slipping on the wet ground, their laughter replaced by sheer panic. The look on their faces, wide-eyed and terrified, was worth every second of the planning. But it didn't end there. Their parents came running out of the house as I had anticipated. Brenda and Steve were furious, charging into the yard without hesitation. But they didn't make it far. Zap! Brenda shrieked, just as the mat shocked her. She stumbled backward, losing her balance, while Steve tripped over the sprinklers, soaked to the bone. The sight of them, disoriented and angry, was almost too much to bear. But I held my ground. Having some trouble? I called out from the porch, watching them flounder in the mud. Steve yelled, "What the hell did you do?" I crossed my arms and smiled. Just protecting my property. Maybe now your kids will stop destroying it. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of quiet satisfaction, but also a weight in my chest. The thrill of having gotten back at the hunters was still lingering, but something felt off. It wasn't the sense of victory I had imagined. Sure, they had been punished, but something about it left me feeling hollow. I could hear the faint sounds of movement outside my window, and when I looked out, I saw the kids, Jake, Nate, and Lily, out in my yard. On their hands and knees, planting flowers. They weren't exactly apologizing, but they were fixing what they had destroyed. I watched them, unsure of how to feel. The sight should have been satisfying. They were repairing the damage they'd done, after all. But as I stood there, watching them dig in the dirt, I couldn't help but feel that it wasn't enough. They weren't acknowledging the emotional toll it had taken on me, the countless hours I had spent nurturing my garden, and the pain of watching it torn apart. This wasn't an apology. This wasn't redemption. This was just an act of restitution, and it left me feeling as unsatisfied as I had been before. I had spent so much time hoping for this moment, wishing they would see the error of their ways, and yet it felt empty. Seeing them on their hands and knees didn't feel like victory, it felt like a hollow gesture. One that would never erase the frustration and the anger that had been building up for so long. The truth was, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Not for me, not for them. The days passed, and the patchwork repairs seemed to serve as a temporary fix to a much deeper problem. My garden began to recover, the flowers slowly sprouting back to life. But the tension lingered in the air like a cloud waiting to burst. That's when the petty revenge began. It started small, subtle, almost as if they thought I wouldn't notice. Empty cans started to appear in my yard, discarded wrappers blowing in from across the street. I picked them up, grumbling under my breath, but it didn't stop there. One morning, I found something worse, dog poop. Not just any poop, but the kind that was clearly placed there intentionally and in a conspicuous spot. I knew exactly who it was. The hunters were getting back at me, trying to make me pay for what I had done to them. I tried to ignore it, told myself it was just childish behavior, something I could brush off. But the truth was, it was driving me crazy. The constant feeling of being harassed, of being disrespected. It wore on me. It wasn't just about the garden anymore. It was about principle. I couldn't let them get away with this. They needed to understand that their actions had consequences. That's when things took a darker turn. One night, as I was reviewing security footage, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was Steve, sneaking around my yard in the dead of night, carrying a bag. No doubt, It was the same salt he'd used to ruin my garden before. I watched in disbelief as he emptied it onto the soil, scattering it like some form of malevolent ritual. Salt, salt. He was trying to ruin the soil for months. It would kill the plants, prevent anything from growing in that part of the garden for God knows how long. That was the tipping point. I called the police. I had enough proof, and I wasn't going to let this go any longer. When the officers arrived, they took the footage, and within an hour, Steve was arrested for vandalism and trespassing. I watched it all from my window, a mix of disbelief and satisfaction coursing through me. Brenda's reaction was exactly what I expected: rage. She was irate, furious that Steve had been caught, furious at me for exposing them for who they were. She screamed and shouted as the officers led Steve away, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for her. I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for any of them. They had brought this upon themselves, and now they were facing the consequences. But in the end, as much as I had wanted to see them get what they deserved, something about it didn't feel as sweet as I had thought it would. There was no joy in watching them struggle, no satisfaction in seeing them unravel. It was like I had won a battle but lost the war, because in the end, I was still left with the mess of all that had happened. And then, just as quickly as they had arrived, the hunters were gone. A for sale sign appeared in their front yard, and within a few days, their house was empty. The house that had been the center of so much chaos and frustration for me was now quiet. The yard, once filled with the sound of their laughter and destruction, was eerily still. It was over. But the sense of relief I had expected didn't come. Instead, I felt something else. A hollow, uncomfortable silence that seemed to stretch on forever. A few months later, as I was trimming the hedges, I saw a familiar face from across the street. It was Jake, the kid who had started it all. But he wasn't the same cocky, reckless boy I had known. He was different now, quieter. He looked down at the ground, clearly hesitant, as though he wasn't sure how to approach me. "I just wanted to say sorry," Jake said, his voice small and unsure. His eyes were downcast, avoiding mine. "I didn't get it before, but I do now. About the garden and everything." The words hit me harder than I expected. There it was, the apology I had been waiting for. But instead of feeling vindicated or relieved, I just felt a wave of exhaustion. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about the boy who had learned something from all of this. A lesson not just about respect, but about understanding the value of hard work and the consequences of one's actions. I smiled, though it wasn't as triumphant as I thought it would be. "It takes a big person to admit when they're wrong, Jake," I said, my voice softer than I'd intended. "I appreciate it." And just like that, the weight of the past few months seemed to lift just a little. It wasn't a happy ending, but it was an ending. The neighborhood slowly went back to normal. No more broken flowers. No more late-night pranks. Just peace. But as I stood there, looking at Jake, something inside me shifted. I wasn't mad anymore. I wasn't even upset. The anger that had consumed me for so long seemed to dissolve. Maybe it was the apology. Maybe it was the realization that not everything needed to be fixed with retribution. Perhaps in some way. Jake's apology, his acknowledgement of what he'd done, was the real resolution. I didn't need to hold on to the anger anymore. They were gone, the damage had been repaired, and it was time to move on. The garden would grow again, just like everything else in life. And maybe, just maybe, this was the first step toward truly finding peace. So, what do you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts and feelings about the story. Leave a comment and share your opinion with me. Did you agree with how things turned out? Or would you have handled it differently? And hey, don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to keep up with more stories like this one. Your support means a lot and helps me bring even better content to you. Thanks so much for sticking around and listening to the entire story. I can't wait to share the next one with you.